Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Helix Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins in a private scientific research base located in the Arctic, where two biological experts suddenly fall dead. The remaining individual, though still breathing, exhibited alarming symptoms, with red eyes and a constant flow of black liquid from the corners of his mouth. After drinking water, his throat began to tremble violently. It appeared as if he had contracted an unknown virus. Upon receiving the news, the Disease Control Center immediately dispatched a top team of experts to investigate. Leading the team was Dr. Allen, a seasoned expert with extensive pandemic handling experience. His team included several senior experts and a technical officer, Major Sergio, sent by the military. Upon their arrival, Dr. Hiroshi, the director of the research base, welcomed them and immediately granted them the highest level of access. The research base was larger than they had imagined, with many layers divided into different zones, and it housed over 100 scientific researchers. Without taking a break, Allen and his team donned protective suits, preparing to visit the infected survivor first. The infected doctor, named Peter, was of special interest as he was Dr. Allen's younger brother. Although Peter had not died from the infection, his vital signs were extremely poor. Peter's face was covered in red lines, and his blood was black. Before he could speak, he suddenly lunged at Allen with a syringe. Just as the two were locked in a standoff, Allen's assistant Julia pulled out a sedative and stabbed it into Peter, temporarily calming him down. Although no one was injured in the incident, it left everyone with a chill. They wondered why Peter had turned into such a state and what kind of virus he had contracted. After a short rest, the team made their way to the morgue to examine the other two deceased infected individuals. However, as they opened the body bag, they were shocked to see a large puddle of black liquid. The body inside had already been reduced to bones. They had never seen a virus that could dissolve human tissue so rapidly. They knew they had to figure out how Peter got infected. Dr. Allen assigned the accompanying expert, Dr. Doreen, and the military representative, Sergio, to go to Peter's lab to collect clues. The lab only had lab mice, but no more monkeys for tests. The base staff claimed that they never used monkeys in their experiments. This claim raised suspicions between Doreen and Sergio. Doreen confirmed through simple tests on the mice that the unknown virus could not be transmitted through the air. She confidently removed her isolation helmet. After careful searching, they found residual macaque hair in the sewer bend pipe, confirming that the base had indeed conducted experiments using monkeys. Monkeys are one of the few animals that can transmit viruses to humans. But why would they deliberately hide this? With questions swirling in their minds, Doreen and Sergio began to search for the place where the monkeys were kept. They were stopped by a large door at the end of the corridor. The door's interface indicated they didn't have the authorization to open it. However, Major Sergio used a cooling liquid to force open the door lock. This was an incredibly messy storage room filled with empty iron cages. The air was filled with an unbearable odor. Doreen recognized it as the place where the experimental monkeys were kept, but for some reason, the cage doors were pried open from the inside. Just then, a shadow flickered by. Doreen recognized it as a monkey. As she was about to approach, the monkey suddenly lunged at her. Fortunately, Sergio stepped in time and knocked the monkey down with a stick. After Doreen confirmed that she had no wounds, she finally had the chance to examine the monkey. Its throat was trembling constantly, which was very similar to Peter's symptoms after infection. At the same time, Julia also felt that something was amiss. As she flipped through Peter's experiment logs, she asked Dr. Hiroshi what research project Peter was actually working on. He revealed that Peter was involved in gene mutation research, which took Julia by surprise. This was a high-risk research project. At the same time, the investigation team leader Allen was in Peter's dorm room. On the wall hung childhood photographs of the two brothers. After turning on the computer, he saw many experiment logs stored inside. He randomly opened one, which seemed to be a daily reflection, but the hand signs in the log caught Allen's attention. They were signals the brothers used in their childhood, meaning there was danger and to leave quickly. Just then, his assistant rushed in to inform him that there was a problem in the isolation ward. Allen rushed to check, only to find that his brother was missing. The broken ceiling above indicated that he had escaped into the ventilation duct. This shocked everyone, unable to believe that Peter, who was barely alive in the morning, had managed to escape. Dr. Hiroshi immediately activated the emergency system, releasing anesthetic gas in the ventilation duct, planning to knock him out first to prevent others in the base from getting infected. After about half an hour, when he felt it was about time, Alan crawled into the ventilation duct with a security guard. The duct was dark and narrow, and they could only crawl forward. Fortunately, it didn't take long before Alan found residual black liquid on the duct, which should have been left behind when Peter passed by. Alan sped up his crawling and soon saw a figure, but it turned out that the person was not the infected Peter. With great difficulty, they pulled the person out of the duct, only to confirm that he had stopped breathing. His security uniform and palms were all gone. At the same time, the assistant Julia and the intern Sarah were testing Peter's blood. They found the virus structure in it to be very special, like a species that had been extinct since ancient times. Alan arrived and was shocked to know that. This virus could self-replicate and, what's worse, could possibly mutate. This might be the reason why Peter did not die, possibly because the deadly virus inside him had mutated. However, what kind of changes he would undergo was unknown. Little did they know, their words and actions were now all under the surveillance of Dr. Hiroshi. Suddenly, a figure walked into the surveillance room. It was Major Sergio. It turned out that he and Dr. Hiroshi were both working for the same boss. Apparently, he came here to cover up some truths within the base. Afterward, Sergio returned to his dormitory, pulling out parts hidden in his backpack. He quickly assembled them into a signal transmitter and strode towards the research base. Just as he was about to install and adjust the device, he noticed a multitude of monkey corpses frozen into ice sculptures. It seemed they were all here. While everyone was occupied with their tasks, the infected Peter walked down the hallways in his uniform, seemingly relaxed. As he passed a room, he picked up a broken arm and used the credentials on it to open the door. Immediately, screams echoed inside the room. For unknown reasons, the 5 lab personnel inside were not harmed. Peter merely forced a mouth-to-mouth contact, as if intentionally trying to spread the virus. 2 of the individuals managed to escape after Peter left, leaving only 3 unlucky ones to be quarantined. Despite their resistance, they were ignored. In the meantime, Alan, along with the security team, began inspecting the rooms, hoping to find Peter and the 2 escapees who might be infected. Luckily, they found one of the escapees in the stairwell. The security didn't show any mercy and apprehended him as if he were a criminal. Upon seeing this, others panicked and demanded to leave the research base. But Alan couldn't agree to their demands. They still hadn't figured out the source and mode of transmission of the virus. Anyone leaving the base could potentially spread the virus. Under his words, everyone reluctantly returned to their dormitories and waited for news. But the panic continued to spread unconsciously. Meanwhile, Doreen was in the lab, calculating the infection rate of the virus. Suddenly, she felt someone behind her. Turning around, she saw it was the other escapee, looking pale and red-eyed, showing all signs of infection. He kept mumbling about everyone being liars, then suddenly lunged at Doreen. After being thrown off, he collapsed unconscious. Doreen, narrowly escaping again, quickly sent him to the quarantine room. However, the 3 quarantined individuals were not at peace, especially as one began to show symptoms of infection. Seeing this, Sarah decided to go to the pharmacy for some painkillers. Just as she reached the shelves, Peter appeared. Thankfully, the iron bars held him back, preventing him from hurting anyone. After a few silent seconds, Peter darted into the ventilation duct like a spider pig. Hearing the commotion, Alan rushed over and comforted Sarah, using his words but not muscles. Suddenly, someone found a used tranquilizer bottle in the corner, which surprised Alan, thinking that Peter could still be conscious and use the medication. This thought gave rise to more confusion about what his brother had been through. At this point, Julia was looking through Peter's experiment logs. She found he had injected 2 substances named Narvik A and Narvik B into lab mice, but there were no records of the experiment's results. This made Julia suspicious, and she decided to run the experiment again with the 2 substances. The results came soon after, showing that all mice injected with Narvik A died, similar to the first 2 deceased individuals. Those injected with Narvik B survived, but showed symptoms of infection. What surprised Julia even more was that one of the mice became extremely agitated and broke through its glass enclosure to attack the others. This uncontrollable madness was similar to Peter's state, almost a perfect virus spreader. After hearing the report, Alan was unsettled. He rushed to question Dr. Hiroshi about why he concealed the monkey experiments and why he studied such a dangerous virus. Dr. Hiroshi didn't offer any explanation, but instead blamed Alan for his negligence. After all, his original intention of reporting to the Disease Control Center was to get Alan and other experts to control the virus's spread, but the situation was getting worse. In the quarantine room where the suspected patients were being held, the 3 quarantined individuals suddenly overpowered Sarah and her team as if they had planned it. They then quickly escaped the quarantine room. Now the virus was likely to spread entirely throughout the research base. The infected individuals lose consciousness and become violent upon showing symptoms. The first 5 victims of this outbreak are mostly displaying signs of infection. As time goes on, the number of victims continues to increase. As the base leader, Dr. Hiroshi has to intensify the search efforts and somehow isolate these potential infected individuals. However, with limited vacant rooms, they are forced to repurpose long-abandoned floors. These floors are equipped with all necessary living facilities and are separated from other floors. They were once used for nuclear fusion research, but have been abandoned due to project termination. It's the ideal place for isolating the infected. Currently, there are 18 confirmed suspected patients, with 3 still on the run. As some of them are discussing further measures, a woman with a pale face suddenly appears. She was one of the first victims attacked by patient Zero Peter and had secretly escaped from the isolation room. Now she seems to be infected and is seeking help. Unexpectedly, the security captain fires a shot without giving her a chance to explain. Upon seeing the woman fall injured, Alan rushes forward to treat her wounds. He believes it's inhumane to treat patients this way, but the security captain insists he did nothing wrong. He's protecting the life of Dr. Hiroshi, the person in charge. Upon hearing this, Alan is furious and expresses that if such an incident occurs again, he will leave the base with his team. Alan knows the rescue work must continue. To ensure the effectiveness of the isolation, Alan feels a virus screening must be carried out on everyone. Although Julia had previously confirmed that the pathogen was the Narvik bee from the lab, it is now mutated. Sarah states that several hours of experimentation are required to confirm a new testing method. Meanwhile, Doreen continues her research experiment to find an effective treatment method. Due to immense pressure, Sarah's hand trembles uncontrollably. After 3 hours and numerous tests, Sarah finally finds a way to detect the virus. Hundreds of test reagents are quickly prepared. All staff in the base are summoned to the hall to start the virus testing. Surprisingly, the test results showed that almost a third of the people were infected. Alan suppressed his shock and arranged for the security guards to move all the infected individuals to the newly opened isolation area. One engineer resisted, smashing a dormitory door with an axe, shouting for antidotes, but a security guard hurriedly knocked him down. Curiously, Alan knocked on the dormitory door and a specialist emerged. He nervously stated that there were no antidotes and then hurriedly left. Alan sensed something was off. He ran to question Dr. Hiroshi about what exactly the so-called virus antidote was. He also threatened to expose everything happening within the base. Left with no choice, Dr. Hiroshi confessed the truth. The base had been developing a universal antidote that could successfully kill all known viruses. However, its harm to the human body was also significant, so it had not been disclosed yet. Alan was chilled to the bone upon hearing this. He was shocked at the audacious experiments conducted by the research base. Cultivating viruses recklessly was inhumane and illegal. So he decided to report this matter and requested more reinforcements. But Julia told him that they were in the Arctic, where satellite communication was only possible 1 day a week. Alan had no choice but to wait a few more days. Meanwhile, the security guards at the research base were transferring the infected individuals. As soon as they opened the door to the ward, an infected individual who had gone berserk rushed out. It was one of the first patients who had been injured. The security captain was scared to shit his pants, having never faced such a situation before. He lay on the ground and watched the infected individual run off. News spread among the other patients ready to be quarantined, and knowing that the virus could cause one to lose their mind, they started to scatter. The limited security personnel couldn't control the situation. Just then, a loud roar echoed through the area. The berserk patient reappeared, causing everyone to start running. Julia reacted a little late, watching as the patient rushed towards her. Suddenly, a gunshot sounded and the patient fell to the ground. Alan had fired just in time to save the day. It was somewhat ironic since that berserk patient was someone he had personally treated earlier. Alan didn't have time to think about this and tried to leave with Julia, but she declined. She had accidentally been splashed with the patient's blood during the confrontation and needed to be quarantined. Even though Alan was reluctant, he had to order the sealing of the connecting passage, isolating Julia and all the infected patients. He sternly stated that as soon as the satellite communication was up, he would seek reinforcements from the CDC. On the other side, Dr. Doreen, accompanied by Major Sergio, began researching the experimental monkeys. She added a growth factor to the blood, which allowed the cells to multiply rapidly for extensive testing. Unexpectedly, the virus in the blood grew visibly fast. Doreen immediately activated the cooling device to kill the terrifying virus. Having worked for many years, Doreen had never encountered such a situation. Common viruses do not have energy nor metabolism. She assumed something must have gone wrong with its genetic sequence. After a series of comparative tests, Doreen made a startling discovery. The virus's genetic combination was very special, definitely not a result of natural evolution. It was like it had been pieced together by human gene fragments, causing horrific changes from the inside out. Knowing that this was a horrifying crime, Doreen decided to report this to Alan, but she didn't notice the gloomy expression on Sergio's face. Pretending to leave, he suddenly stabbed a syringe into Doreen's neck. After ensuring she was unconscious, he knocked over the shelf with the lab rats, making it look like an accident. The man then went outside the research base and set fire to the bodies of the monkeys containing the original virus. Obviously, he was sent here to cover up the truth and prevent it from being discovered. At this point, Alan was anxious, feeling that the situation was becoming uncontrollable. He hoped that the date for satellite connection would come quickly. As he passed a lab, a figure suddenly appeared. It was Patient Zero, Peter. He seemed lucid at the moment, pleading with his brother to save him. Seeing Peter collapse unconscious, Alan immediately took him to the treatment room. It's shown that the virus had spread throughout his body, and it seemed unlikely he would last until dawn. Alan thought of the universal antidote still in the experimental phase. Since it could kill all viruses, it should surely be able to cure Peter. The specialist quickly objected, saying that the universal antidote was one of his projects. Although it could kill viruses, the host's survival rate was less than 25%. But at this point, Alan had to take a risk, administering the antidote to his brother under the guise of family consent. After the medicine entered his body, Peter fell into a deep coma. Alan sat by the bedside, hoping for a miracle. Surprisingly, Peter did open his eyes, causing Alan to weep with joy. He had many things to say to his brother and many questions to ask, but before he could open his mouth, the specialist noticed that the viral load in Peter's body, which had significantly decreased after the antidote use, was now growing rapidly. Clearly, the universal antidote could not completely eliminate the virus. Alan was on the verge of collapse, anxiously asking his brother what he had done. Peter insisted he had done nothing unusual. His usual work involved dissecting animal bodies. For some reason, Dr. Hiroshi was particularly interested in Julie, often asking Peter about her condition, but he soon closed his eyes again. It was clear that Peter was on the brink. The specialist rushed forward to administer aid. Although they managed to save Peter's life, he ended up in a vegetative state, his life sustained only by a respirator. On Julia's side, she was in the isolation zone, standing in place for a long time before recovering from her shock. As she passed the hall, she discovered that many test reagents, originally green to indicate infection, had turned colorless. Julia realized there were flaws in the testing method, which could lead to errors in screening for infected people. She prepared to report this to Alan. However, as she connected the call, the signal transceiver outside was blown up, severing her communication with Alan. Julia pounded on the isolation door, but no matter how she yelled, no one answered. She had to return to the hall to discuss plans with the infected people. They had to establish contact with the outside as soon as possible. In contrast, a staff member was pessimistic, believing they had been abandoned. He knew there was an air purification control on this floor. If it was shut down, the entire base would fall into an oxygen deficit, forcing the people above to negotiate. Julia thought this plan was risking everyone's lives, but the man was furious and kicked Julia out of the hall. Julia was dumbfounded, wondering where she should go. Suddenly, she saw a figure in a hazmat suit waving at her from the end of the corridor, but when Julia caught up, she saw no one. As she was at a loss, she suddenly heard a sound not far away. Looking curiously, she saw an infected person searching for supplies. As Julia was preparing to leave, the infected person suddenly charged at her like a madman. It seemed he had fallen into a frenzied state. As Julia passed by a room, someone pulled her sexy body in. Her arm was instantly broken by the immense force, yet the infected seemed unfazed and slowly walked away. Once everything calmed down, Julia, feeling somewhat tense, stared at the masked figure who had extended a hand to her. Unexpectedly, the mysterious figure was a woman. For some reason, the mysterious woman seemed familiar with Julia, and they quickly became acquainted. After a brief rest, they ventured into the corridors again, intending to regroup with the patients in the main hall. However, the infected were looming nearby, frightening the two women to retreat back to the storeroom they had previously hidden in. By this point, Julia had started showing symptoms of the infection. Unwilling to sit and wait for her demise, she decided to take a risk and find a solution. Just as they reached the corridor, an injured man appeared. Upon closer look, it was Dr. Hiroshi, the base director. It turned out that just a few hours ago, the infected patients in the quarantine zone had shut off the air filtration system. The system's monitor triggered an alarm. The security captain thought that the quarantined patients were causing trouble and planned to go and resolve the issue. Little did they know, Dr. Hiroshi's office hid a secret door leading directly to the quarantine zone. The two quickly arrived at the control room where they encountered the patient who had shut off the filtration system. Dr. Hiroshi promised to get them out of the quarantine zone. After exchanging glances, they managed to restore the system. However, when it was Dr. Hiroshi's turn to fulfill his promise, they were greeted with several gunshots. The security captain was shocked by the countermeasures, but Dr. Hiroshi believed that those who make a mistake once will certainly repeat it. He had the security stay behind to deal with the body while he walked deeper into the corridor. For some unknown reason, when he passed the raging infected, he wasn't attacked. Surprisingly, Dr. Hiroshi deliberately stabbed himself with a sharp knife. After that, he claimed that he was originally there to deliver supplies to the patients. But his kindness was repaid with a stabbing. Julia believed him and began to treat him, but medical conditions were limited there. He mentioned a well-equipped lab at the end of the corridor where his wounds could be stitched. The corridor was long, and before they could reach the halfway point, several rats scurried past them as though evading some terrifying existence. Intrigued, Julia dropped her flashlight and suddenly saw an infected standing in the darkness. The group was so scared that they immediately ran. The mysterious woman was tackled in an instant, leaving only Julia and Dr. Hiroshi, who managed to hide in a room. Listening to the screams outside, they knew they couldn't help. They had no choice but to sit down and wait. Dr. Hiroshi kept looking at Julia, saying she looked like his deceased daughter, but Julia didn't respond. Once they noticed it had become quiet outside, they helped Dr. Hiroshi proceed. But not far off, another infected appeared. They had to retreat back to the room they were just in. As the infected was about to rush in, the mysterious woman suddenly appeared and knocked the infected to the ground. Unbelievably, she was still alive. Afterwards, they brought Dr. Hiroshi to the lab and began to stitch his wound. When the operation was completed, Julia fell into exhaustion. The symptoms of the infection were also becoming more severe. She would also become an unconscious infected. Just then, Dr. Hiroshi woke up. Julia went over to check on him and was shocked to find that his wound, which was bleeding a few hours ago, was almost healed. Dr. Hiroshi mysteriously said that maybe his genes were good. At this point, Julia realized that she hadn't seen the mysterious woman for a long time. Dr. Hiroshi sighed and said that the mysterious woman she mentioned didn't exist at all, and that everything was a hallucination caused by Julia's early symptoms of the virus. That's why he didn't expose it then. Julia was shattered and wanted to leave this hellish place immediately. But then her body started convulsing uncontrollably. It seemed like the virus had fully erupted. Dr. Hiroshi hurriedly helped her onto the experimental table and injected her with a red liquid, explaining that it was just a sedative. After Julia lost consciousness, Dr. Hiroshi blocked the lab door and hurriedly left. Meanwhile, Dr. Allen, after administering the universal antidote to his younger brother, didn't give up. Through careful study of the antidote, he felt that there was still significant room for improvement. However, it would require a large number of animal experiments. Allen knew this was Doreen's area of expertise. Upon arriving at her lab, he found her already cold and lifeless. Although the scene looked like an accident, Allen felt that things were not that simple. He asked the security captain to retrieve surveillance footage from the control room, but the surveillance video had been deliberately damaged. Even the backup was deleted. Obviously, Doreen's death was no accident. The security captain discovered through another camera that Sergio had been in and out of Doreen's lab. Without a doubt, he was the prime suspect. Unaware that his crime was about to be exposed, Sergio was preparing to retreat after destroying the virus-carrying lab monkey. But his superiors issued new orders through a satellite phone, asking him to find a doctor. Sergio had no choice but to return to the base, opened Dr. Hiroshi's computer, and began searching for information about the doctor. Strangely, there was no record of this person on the base personnel list. Just then, the security captain appeared. Sergio, unfazed, asked about the whereabouts of the said doctor. The captain firmly stated that there was no such person here. After Sergio left, the captain shared his suspicions with Alan. But without solid evidence, he could only take Alan to Sergio's dormitory. After a search, they found a box of plastic explosives. The security captain suspected that the satellite receiver outside was likely destroyed by Sergio. Then, Alan found a satellite phone with many text messages stored in it, including a report covering up the truth about killing Dr. Doreen. The last message was an order from above to find the said doctor in the White Room. The captain understood what the White Room meant, so he went outside the base alone, followed a tether to an open space, and pressed an inconspicuous switch. Several white glass covers rose from the ground. So this was the so-called White Room, and inside was the said doctor's skull. Just then, Major Sergio appeared, striking the captain down with a stick. It turned out he had been quietly following him. The mission assigned from above was finally accomplished. Sergio took back his satellite phone and was about to send a message when the security captain suddenly stabbed him with an ice axe. Obviously, Sergio had underestimated the captain's vitality, and he would pay for this with his life. At this point, Dr. Allen had already buried Doreen's body in the icy wilderness. Just as he was about to confront Sergio, the security captain rushed over to tell him that Sergio had disappeared and advised him not to waste energy on him. Alan could only suppress his anger and focus all his efforts on improving the antidote. He was worried that Julia, who was in the isolation layer, might also encounter danger. Therefore, he asked the security team to bring her up, but they refused, citing that it would violate isolation regulations. Soon after, Alan found the doors to the isolation layer completely sealed and decided to find a way down from the level above. He cut a large hole in the floor guardrail and finally reached the isolation layer. However, the door in front was locked with an iron chain. As he prepared to saw it open, Sarah saw a shadow moving on the other side. Out of curiosity, she moved closer, only for a large hand to reach out, followed by two infected individuals. Alan reacted quickly, sawing off the nasty hand that had grabbed Sarah's sexy body. They both retreated in fear, running back the way they had come. Thankfully, Sarah hadn't been scratched. The thought of what might have happened scared Alan. It was likely that the patients in the isolation layer were in dire straits. They had to abandon their rescue plans and focus on their research. Before long, Alan also discovered that the virus had been artificially implanted into the genetic sequence. Like what Dr. Doreen did, he added a growth factor for further research. As expected, the virus began to grow rapidly. Alan quickly sprayed liquid nitrogen to stop it. Seeing the lifeless virus, Alan had a sudden idea. Since the virus feared low temperatures, reducing his younger brother's body temperature might also alleviate his infection symptoms. When Peter's body was wrapped in ice bags, his condition indeed improved. Without a doubt, Alan's hypothesis was correct. However, the degree to which they could lower the temperature was limited. Sarah remembered that there was a lab in the base that specialized in refrigeration technology. Perhaps they could try their luck there. When Alan arrived at the refrigeration lab, he was stunned by the sight before him. Several mice were peacefully floating in an unknown liquid. This was the latest refrigeration technology developed by Dr. Adrian. However, this was the first time it was being used on humans. Using a cooling liquid to permeate the human body from the inside out could effectively lower body temperature. As Peter's entire body was filled with the liquid, Sarah was a bit panicked, wondering if he could breathe. But Dr. Adrian stated that as long as the oxygen content in the blood was maintained, whether or not he breathed was irrelevant. As time passed, Peter's body temperature gradually dropped. It was unclear whether this time the virus inside his body could be completely eliminated. Meanwhile, Dr. Hiroshi, the director of the research base, is treating the infected in another way. He injects an unknown drug into the patient's body. As the patient falls into a coma, he confidently leaves the lab, as though everything is under control. However, a word from the security captain disrupts his calm. Major Sergio, the investigator sent by the headquarters, has been killed. Dr. Hiroshi insists on seeing the body. If Sergio's not dead, he might report the base's actions to the headquarters. Surprisingly, although Sergio had clearly suffered a fatal injury and was stripped of his coat, his body was nowhere to be found. As the captain prepares to search the vicinity, several helicopters land in the base. Dr. Hiroshi's face drastically changes as these are reinforcements sent by the headquarters. A team of fully armed soldiers disembark from the planes. The headquarters had not received a message from Sergio for 2 days, triggering the reinforcement action. Leading the team is a woman named Sutton, who assures everyone that she will cooperate with Alan in developing an antivirus. But when Alan mentions wanting to call the CDC, Sutton states that she is powerless to help. Alan has no choice but to make a lesser request: rescue Julia, his assistant trapped in the isolation layer, as she is irreplaceable in the development of the antidote. After thinking for a moment, Sutton agrees. Sutton then calls Dr. Hiroshi into her office alone. The moment the door closes, her demeanor changes, clearly dissatisfied with Dr. Hiroshi. It turns out that the headquarters had tasked him with developing both the virus and the antidote. But after all these years, he had only managed to develop the virus, with no progress on the antidote. Now, they have to rely on Dr. Allen from the CDC to speed up the development of the antidote. Dr. Hiroshi seems to understand her well, asking what will happen once the antidote is developed. Sutton answered that once the antidote is obtained, everyone in the base will be dealt with, including Dr. Hiroshi. In order to achieve her goal, she is more than willing to fulfill Alan's request. After a brief rest, she arranges for a pair of soldiers to prepare to go to the isolation layer to rescue people. Alan, fearing they may have ulterior motives, insists on going with them, and Sutton does not refuse. Once the soldiers are ready, everyone boards the elevator to the isolation layer. Alan warns them that the infected are stronger than they can imagine, but Sutton doesn't take it seriously. As the elevator doors open, the group arrives at the infected floor. The corridor, seemingly tranquil, is in fact incredibly dangerous. All the soldiers move forward cautiously. After some effort, they reach the entrance of the main hall, where 2 of them rush into the room. Gunshots and roars quickly echo from within. In the next moment, an infected lunges out, knocking a soldier to the ground. Sutton quickly fires her weapon, clearing the area. Looking back at the soldiers who had just entered the room, they've already been tackled by several infected. Sutton senses trouble and quickly calls for a retreat. Unexpectedly, more and more infected start to follow them, tracing their smell, and the smelly soldiers are knocked down one after another. They manage to hold off the pursuing infected temporarily once they reach the other side of the iron gate. Alan wants to continue the search for Julia, but Sutton objects. Given the current situation, she argues that Julia's odds of survival are slim. As they speak, an infected lunges at them from behind. Alan manages to save Sutton just in time. Surprisingly, she shows no gratitude and instead points her gun at Alan, threatening him to return to the lab immediately. The most important task at hand is to develop the antidote. However, when Alan arrives at the lab, he is stunned to see Julia right before his eyes. He is shocked, wondering how Julia could be here. It turned out, when Julia had fallen into a coma due to the virus inside her body, Dr. Hiroshi had injected her with an unknown substance. Like magic, Julia underwent a dramatic transformation. All signs of the infection disappeared from her body, as if the virus had been eradicated. The only downside was an intense headache, and her pupils had turned silver, making her exceptionally sensitive to light. She had to cover her eyes with a white cloth. Just as she was getting used to her new state, a noise came from outside the door, and an infected suddenly burst in. Julia quickly hid behind a cabinet, not daring to make a sound. She waits until the infected goes away, then she finally removes her eye cloth. But just as she does so, the infected returns suddenly. Julia is so scared that her legs turn to jelly. In her panic, she reveals her silver pupils. To her surprise, the infected creature seems to view her as something even more terrifying than itself, and races away for its shitty life. But Julia's fear seemed to intensify. Just then, Dr. Hiroshi returned to the lab. She hurriedly asked about her eyes, but Dr. Hiroshi didn't answer. Instead, he wept as he bandaged her eyes, as if he had accomplished some monumental task. Once her emotions had stabilized, Dr. Hiroshi gestured to take her away, knowing that if Sutton found her here, there would be no plausible explanation. Following this, the two made their way up to the base via a secret tunnel. Upon seeing Julia again, Alan was amazed that she was unharmed and had successfully eliminated the virus from her body. What's more, the subsequent test showed that there were no traces of the virus in Julia's body, nor any antibodies. She didn't appear to have been infected at all. Upon Dr. Hiroshi's suggestion, Julia had to use contact lenses to cover her silver pupils. Sutton noticed a photo album of Julia's on Dr. Hiroshi's desk. She suspected that Julia was not ordinary, especially when she saw her silver pupils. So she ordered the guards to keep a close eye on the doors, not letting Julia take a single step outside. Even Alan, who had come to visit, was refused entry. Apparently, she knew more about the secret of the silver pupils than she had let on. Sutton then arrested Dr. Hiroshi, accusing him of treachery. She questioned why he had used the precious medicine on Julia, who was supposedly unrelated. Dr. Hiroshi refused to disclose any information. Clearly, aside from the virus and the antidote, Dr. Hiroshi and his corporation were hiding larger secrets. Back in the lab, Alan had no mind to develop the antidote. The priority was to rescue Julia. However, just then, Julia's voice came from above. It turned out that Sutton had only confined her to her bedroom, unaware of a ventilation shaft. Here, Julia encountered a few infected, but they didn't notice her, allowing her to make her way to the lab ceiling. With guards outside the door, Alan played it cool, reassigning tasks. He planned to deal with Sutton himself, while Julia would search for Dr. Hiroshi, so he could regain control of the research, giving everyone a chance at survival. True to his scientist roots, Alan utilized various lab materials to easily create a substantial amount of explosives after mixing them in the right proportions. Once everything was prepared, he notified the guards to inform Sutton that the antidote had been developed. A few minutes later, Sutton arrived at the lab. As she leaned in to observe the drug under the microscope, Alan detonated the explosives, causing an explosion. Without checking the results, he and Sarah both ran out of the lab and hid in a secluded room, waiting for good news from Julia. To their shock, Sutton's voice came over the base's loudspeaker. The woman had indeed survived and was now holding Alan's brother Peter hostage, forcing him to surrender. Alan had to comply and was about to leave when Sarah stopped him. She had discovered that they were in a sonic lab, and there was a sonic cannon right on the table. They could use it against their enemies. Meanwhile, Julia had reached the room where Dr. Hiroshi was detained. After explaining all the plans and preparing to release him, Dr. Hiroshi unexpectedly grabbed an anesthetic and injected it into Julia, knocking her unconscious. When she awoke, she found herself in a hidden compartment, next to a photograph of a younger Julia with Dr. Hiroshi, indicating that they might be a father and daughter. Just then, the door to the hidden compartment was opened, and Sutton's guards captured Julia. Alan boldly approached Sutton, and, as she prepared to deal with the Allen brothers, Sarah appeared wielding the sonic cannon. Several guards were knocked down instantly. As the standoff continued, a few infected individuals suddenly appeared, carrying away Peter, the barely alive patient zero. Dr. Hiroshi quickly led Alan to his office, and when he opened the secret compartment, he was shocked to find Julia missing. At that moment, the security captain came to report that Sutton had locked Julia in a container and was planning to send her to the company headquarters overnight. So Dr. Hiroshi instructed Alan to go rescue Julia while he headed to Sutton's dormitory. After knocking out the guard at the door, he took out a steel wire from his watch and strangled Sutton without any mercy. At the same time, the security captain and his team began to clean up the few remaining guards loyal to Sutton. This allowed Alan and others to successfully rescue Julia. When Dr. Hiroshi placed Sutton's head in the White Room, it seemed the crisis was finally over. However, unknown to everyone, a large group of infected individuals were making their way to the base via the pipeline, evidently seeking revenge. They stealthily arrived through the ventilation ducts to the residential area above the base. The first thing they did was destroy the base's stored supplies, contaminating all the food. Moreover, they rescued Peter. In an unknown enclosed space, all the infected surrounded Peter, each pouring a mouthful of black liquid into his mouth. This miraculous treatment revived Peter like a zombie, ready for a crazy revenge against the survivors. Alan realized that the infected needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. He had Sarah roam the isolation layer corridor alone, and soon enough, infected hiding in the shadows were lured out. The guards lying in wait appeared and worked together to capture it alive. Alan planned to use it to fight against the infected. Just as everyone was preparing to leave, Alan discovered that the ventilation duct on the wall actually led to the area below. He was curious, wondering why there was still space below. Dr. Hiroshi confessed that there was another layer below, used to store original samples of the virus, including the source of this infection, the Narvik virus. He further revealed that the headquarters needed the Narvik virus and its antidote. Over the years, he had intentionally delayed the research progress to prevent the world from being swept by the virus. Now that the conflict had escalated, the headquarters would definitely send more powerful forces here to take the virus and the antidote. Alan made up his mind. He must destroy the virus samples before the next wave of troops arrived. However, all the infected had gathered in the lowest level where the virus samples were stored. To get to the samples, they would have to bypass these infected. When Alan stood before the captured infected, he remembered the virus's vulnerability to low temperatures. With the help of Dr. Hiroshi, he found that when the temperature dropped to certain degrees, the infected would fall into a coma. He had an idea. After all, this base was located in the Arctic area. If they cut off the heating and pressure systems, the indoor temperature would drop significantly, causing the infected to fall into a coma. This would allow them to retrieve the virus samples easily. The only downside was that they couldn't take too long because the staff couldn't stay in a low-temperature environment for too long. Without further ado, Alan and Julia donned their warm coats. The waiting pair quickly shut down the base's heating system, causing cold air to fill the entire space, while Alan and Julia made their way to the bottom level through a secret passage. When they opened the door, they were stunned by the sight before them. Countless infected stood still as if they were mummies. The duo carefully navigated their way through the crowd, eventually reaching the cold storage where the original virus samples were stored. They were surprised at the tons of samples here, which were even more than those stored at the CDC. Alan decided to destroy all the viruses stored there. They were pressed for time and had to act fast. However, to Julia's surprise, the Narvik virus was found missing. She wanted to look around a bit more, but they were running out of time as the heating system was steadily recovering. Alan quickly dragged Julia away. The infected were now regaining consciousness. Alan barely managed to squeeze his way through the zombie crowd and escape the storage room. Julia used a stick to jam the door shut. Just as they were preparing to head back, they discovered a basement. The curious pair went down to check, only to find a cozy living room. Julia was stunned because it was identical to the layout of her home when she was a child. But now was not the time to investigate. They had to return to the upper levels of the base first. Just as they reached the exit, they were surrounded by the infected, led by Peter. Luckily, Julia's genes had mutated, providing a natural suppression against the infected. This allowed them to safely leave the bottom level. Alan was perplexed by Julia's changes, but she couldn't explain it herself. The only person who might know why was Dr. Hiroshi. As they prepared to question him, they found Sarah unconscious. She and Dr. Hiroshi had been in the machine room controlling the heating system when she suddenly fell and began to convulse. Dr. Hiroshi didn't hesitate, quickly lifting her out after restoring the heating system. Alan was frantic, taking her to the infirmary for a full-body examination, but he couldn't figure out the secrets in her sexy body and why she was unconscious. When Julia found Dr. Hiroshi alone, she wanted to ask about the living room on the lowest level. Dr. Hiroshi pulled out a photo, a picture of him with Julia and her mother. It turned out he was Julia's biological father. His pupils were also silver. The hall on the base's lowest level was where little Julia lived. However, she was too young at the time to realize that she was in a research base in the Arctic. This news was too sudden for Julia, and she couldn't accept it at once. The results of Sarah's examination were now in. Surprisingly, there was a tumor at the back of her neck. It had already spread to her spinal fluid, and presumably her life would soon be in danger. However, Sarah seemed remarkably calm. She had previously tried to have the tumor removed, but the surgery failed. What she feared now wasn't death, but missing the opportunity to do something truly meaningful. Alan, however, wasn't ready to give up. He sought Dr. Hiroshi to inquire about any possible solutions. To his surprise, Dr. Hiroshi had discovered clues about the missing Narvik virus through surveillance. It had been stolen by Dr. Adrian. Although he had already left the base, Alan was determined to retrieve the virus. If it were to escape into the outside world, it would be a disaster. However, he couldn't afford to worry about Sarah's condition at this point. He quickly spread out a map of the surrounding base. Julia believed that Dr. Adrian couldn't have gone far. There was a monitoring station a few dozen miles away, and he was likely to have sought refuge there. Alan and Julia didn't dare delay and decided to head to the monitoring station immediately. Despite the heavy snow on the road, they managed to reach the monitoring station in just over an hour. Alan pushed open the door and saw a light coming from inside. Entering, they indeed found Dr. Adrian hiding there. He was currently using a radio to communicate with the headquarters, presumably planning to sell the Narvik virus to them. Fortunately, Alan arrived in time to prevent the transaction. After a bit of a scuffle, they managed to restrain Dr. Adrian. Just as they were preparing to leave with the virus, they discovered a secret passage underground. They followed a ladder down into a dark space and unexpectedly found a live person imprisoned there. This person looked very strange. He was totally bald and his eyes emitted a silver glow. Julia handed him a cup of hot water while asking him why his eyes were silver. It turned out that many years ago, the research base had developed an elixir of life. It could grant people a miraculous self-healing ability and eternal youth, with the notable characteristic of silver pupils. However, some unknown rule dictated that the number of people injected with the drug couldn't exceed 500. But still, the drug for immortality couldn't cure his baldness, and the poor bald man had been locked up in this sunless place by Dr. Hiroshi. After hearing his story, Julia felt uneasy. She was about to cut his handcuffs when he grabbed the iron pliers. Excitedly, he expressed that he didn't want to taste eternal solitude anymore. With that, he plunged the iron pliers into his own neck, ending his bald life. Alan and Julia watched the scene before them in utter shock. It took them a long time to return to the surface. They lit a fire to cremate the bald man's body and tossed the box containing the Narvik virus into the fire. With this, the threat of the Narvik virus was eliminated, and the pair felt a great sense of relief. Alan returned to the base and saw Sarah, who was still unconscious. Her vitals were very unstable, and she could lose her life at any moment. Julia couldn't hide her concerns and asked Dr. Hiroshi why he had locked the bald man in the dungeon under the surveillance station. Dr. Hiroshi simply replied that the man had once intended to harm Julia's mother, so he punished him with a life sentence. As for the mentioned 500 people, they were 500 immortals with silver pupils who controlled the headquarters. Just then, Sarah's heart suddenly stopped. They barely managed to resuscitate her. Seeing Alan's despondent look, Dr. Hiroshi said there was another way to save Sarah. He reminded them of the immortals' ability to kill any virus in their bodies and repair organs. Curing Sarah's tumor would be easy. Unfortunately, the only elixir of immortality in the base had been injected into Julia. Now they could only try infusing her spiral fluid into Sarah. The results were beyond expectation. All of Sarah's indicators returned to normal, and even traces of the tumor couldn't be found. Though Julia didn't understand the principle behind it, she was overwhelmed with excitement. This meant that she could cure all the infected people in the base. But Alan cautioned her that saving only Sarah had already exhausted Julia's body, and it was impossible to share her spinal fluid with others. Meanwhile, the infected had already begun their retaliation against the survivors in the base. Their intelligence seemed to have improved, and they had started to use traps to capture survivors. In just one day, 3 staff members had disappeared. Presumably, they had been infected. Alan had to gather all the remaining survivors to prevent them from being caught when alone. But this played right into the hands of the infected. They collected a large amount of dark fluid and poured it into the base's fire hydrants. The fire sprinklers suddenly sprayed a large amount of infectious fluid, and those in the room had nowhere to escape and were all infected. Without a doubt, all these survivors had turned into infected. Only Alan's group and 4 security personnel were left in the base because they were not in the isolation room. Everyone was in despair. They would definitely not be able to resist the army of the infected with just a few of them. Moreover, it was extremely difficult to escape given they were in the Arctic area. Dr. Hiroshi suggested that everyone hide in a safe refuge while he used explosives to destroy the entire base. But Alan disagreed, believing that these infected were also human lives. They couldn't just indiscriminately kill the innocent. The only choice now was to develop an antidote to the virus as soon as possible. Julia secretly took out 2 tubes of Narvik virus samples from her pocket. It turned out that what they threw into the fire at the monitoring station was just the empty box that contained the samples. The reserve she kept then came in handy now. She used the virus samples and her own immune cells to conduct repeated comparative tests, and finally found a way to kill the Narvik virus. They were all glad to see the antidote had been developed, although Alan was a bit displeased with Julia's act of keeping the virus samples. Sarah recovered rapidly after receiving Julia's spiral fluid. At this moment, she also thought of a critical issue. For the virus antidote to work, it would need some time. They might be able to try combining the antidote with a cooling agent, which might have unexpected effects. So Alan and Julia tested it on a lab rat. Almost instantly, the rat lost its ability to move, and the virus inside its body was rapidly dissolving. At this moment, the security captain pulled out a device that looked like a spray canister. It seemed much more practical than a syringe. With all problems solved, the 2 prepared to test the antidote on the infected. After donning their gear, they went down to the lower tunnels. Unexpectedly, the first one they encountered was Patient Zero, Peter. Dr. Hiroshi immediately began spraying the mixture, causing Peter to fall to the ground, convulsing. Not long after, he spat out a puddle of black liquid, and his complexion returned to normal. The effect of the antidote spray was better than they could have imagined. They did it in the same way, and most of the infected quickly returned to normal. After a while, Peter had regained consciousness and could communicate normally. Alan was pleased to see his brother back to normal. Their struggles had finally paid off. However, little did they know, an even more significant crisis was approaching. Dr. Hiroshi's satellite phone intercepted a short message. Since Sutton had died and no news had been received for a long time, the headquarters would send new troops for investigation. Dr. Hiroshi knew that the armed forces arriving this time would be even stronger. As if he had been prepared for this, he took out a box of remote detonators from his cabinet and placed them in every corner of the base. It seemed he planned to destroy the entire base along with the invaders. He had also thought about where the personnel would go. That would be the lounge on the lowest level, which had been prepared with the highest level of shock resistance. It would ensure that they would not be affected too much when the base was destroyed. Before they had a chance to implement the plan, the base's intrusion alarm sounded. The headquarters armed forces arrived unexpectedly. Dr. Hiroshi and Alan led the security personnel towards the outside of the base. They must buy enough time to transfer all personnel to the safe bunker. As they reached the ambush point outside the base, they saw countless lights driving towards them from a distance. Dr. Hiroshi held his breath, reminding everyone to shoot when they got closer. But before he could give the order, all the approaching lights suddenly went out. The captain pulled out his binoculars to observe. He only saw far-off sleds, and there wasn't a single human figure around. This was truly strange. The captain suspected that this might be a diversion tactic, so he led everyone to the back of the base. Here they saw a sled. Dr. Hiroshi recognized it as a remotely controlled drone and planned to go forward to confirm it. Suddenly, an explosion sounded. Everyone was caught in it, and Dr. Hiroshi was seriously injured. Only then did they see that 3 parachuting figures had dropped down. Alan and the others rushed the injured Dr. Hiroshi into the refuge. By this time, most of the survivors had been transferred here. Dr. Hiroshi, enduring the pain, kept urging the captain to detonate the bombs. The last group of survivors heading to the refuge met the 3 men in black who had parachuted down and began their slaughter. These survivors all met their tragic fates. At this moment, the security captain in the refuge was ready. However, when he pressed the detonator, there was no response. It turned out that the 3 men in black had known about this trick and had blocked the detonation signal in advance. Their first stop upon arriving at the base was the cold storage where the virus was kept. Seeing that the virus samples inside were gone, they set their sights on Dr. Hiroshi. Unexpectedly, their eyes were also silver. Although the man in black looked young, he was not young in age, or else Dr. Hiroshi wouldn't be so apprehensive of him. This time, the headquarters wanted to obtain the virus and the antidote, capture Dr. Hiroshi alive, and eliminate any witnesses. When Alan saw the bodies scattered in the elevator, he recognized the ruthlessness of the men in black. The captain reminded him not to linger for too long, as the enemy would discover them through surveillance. At this time, the man in black was indeed staring at the surveillance screen, even pulling up recordings from a few days ago. When he saw the scene of Dr. Hiroshi killing Sutton, he was burning with anger. It turned out he was Sutton's biological son. Just then, they saw on the surveillance screen that Alan and Dr. Hiroshi had left the research base with the virus samples. By this time, Dr. Hiroshi's injuries had completely healed. The elixir of life was indeed powerful. The man in black couldn't know what they were trying to do, so he quietly followed them with his men. Seeing Dr. Hiroshi preparing to hide the virus in a concealed glass tube, the man stepped forward, threatening him with a gun to hand over the virus. Unexpectedly, Dr. Hiroshi threw the virus out. The subordinate quickly moved forward, but the next moment, a deep pit suddenly opened up in the snow, causing the man to fall into the valley. By the time Alan tried to deter with a gun, the man had already disappeared. It turned out that this was a trap set by Alan, but they didn't catch the main culprit, and instead had enraged the enemy. Through the dialogue in the recording, the man in black found out about Dr. Hiroshi's weakness and decided to launch the most vicious revenge. He started by sabotaging the elevator, then kidnapped Dr. Hiroshi's daughter, Julia. Those hiding in the bunker soon received a note. If they wanted to save her, someone had to bring the virus samples to the control room alone. Attached to the note was one of Julia's fingers. The security captain volunteered to complete the transaction. However, the man in black acted without honor. He not only refused to release Julia, but also captured the security captain. This time, he demanded that Dr. Hiroshi came in person. Dr. Hiroshi had no choice but to go for his daughter's and subordinates' sake. But as soon as he arrived at the control room, the man ordered him to kneel in submission if he wanted to save the hostages. Although reluctant, Dr. Hiroshi knelt for Julia and the captain's sake. The man in black seemed unimpressed, stating that the game was just beginning. Then, lights illuminated the back of the control room, revealing Julia and the security captain, each wearing a collar that could explode at any moment. The man told Dr. Hiroshi that he could only take one of them with him, and the other would undoubtedly die. This left Dr. Hiroshi with a heart-wrenching choice: his biological daughter or the captain he'd raised like a son. The man seemed delighted, pressing a 30-second countdown button with a gleeful smile. The security captain, assessing the situation, didn't want to put Dr. Hiroshi in a difficult position and sacrificed himself. In a mere moment, he was reduced to a pile of flesh. Dr. Hiroshi, filled with rage, tackled the man in black, and Alan arrived just in time to knock him out. Dr. Hiroshi deactivated the collar's detonation switch, and Julia was finally safe. However, Dr. Hiroshi found himself immersed in endless pain for the loss of the captain. After this incident, Julia fully recognized her father, Dr. Hiroshi. She understood that his years of denial were actually his best way to protect her. But no one expected that Alan's brother, Peter, had already defected to the headquarters and was in cahoots with the man in black. He not only let the man in black go, but also handed over the bomb detonator to him. Afterward, he put on a pitiful act and went to report that the man in black had escaped. Alan was flustered. He knew the man in black could call for reinforcements at any moment. Ultimately, he decided to abandon the base, telling everyone to pack up and start a large migration. Along the way, he handed the virus samples and the antidote to Julia for safekeeping. Just as everyone had finished packing and were about to step through the door, they were met by the man in black waiting outside. The moment he pressed the detonator, the entire base was engulfed in a sea of flames. Most of the people fell to the ground, lifeless. Thankfully, Alan, who was at the outskirts, wasn't severely injured. As he got up, he saw the man in black had taken Julia hostage again, obtaining both the virus and the antidote in the process. As Julia was Dr. Hiroshi's descendant, the man in black's mission was completed successfully. Shortly after, a military helicopter descended. The man in black hurriedly took Julia aboard, but Dr. Allen didn't give up. He took out the head of the man's mother, Sutton, and threw it up. Seizing the moment of the man's distraction, he leapt onto the helicopter. He wanted to take Julia away, but it was too late. All she could do was say goodbye and pass the virus samples to Alan. Alan watched the sky with resentment, helplessly watching the helicopter fly further away. A year later, Alan still hadn't given up on finding Julia. After facing numerous hardships, he finally found the location of the headquarters. Before executing the plan to rescue Julia, he met with his brother Peter, unaware of his betrayal. Meanwhile, within the headquarters, a group of high-ranking officials with silvery pupils gathered around a conference table, a vacant seat at the head of the table, as if waiting for someone. After a while, the conference room doors opened and a woman arrived to take the head seat. Unbelievably, it was Julia, who had been missing for a long time and had defected to the headquarters. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.